welcome to this gorgeous theater. I've never been here before, and it's so lovely, and it's such an honor to be here speaking with you tonight. I just want to start by thanking Christopher Smith, who put this all together, which is amazing. Marcia Ayman, who originally invited me several years ago, but I finally have managed to get here. I want to thank Kim Hayden, who is the archivist who helped me work in the Center for Sacramento History. And then I have to acknowledge that this is home for me in several ways. So I grew up in Davis, California, not so far away, so I know we have a few Davis sites here. And my in-laws are up in Truckee now. My folks spent a lot of time in Lotus. And then I think Sacramento also archivally is a home for me because I spent so much time in this book in particular at the Center for Sacramento History, but also at the California State Library and the California State Archives. So this is a place I keep coming back to, so I'm really excited to present it today. And I want to just do one last thing and thank my parents who are here. It's really special to come home. And my in-laws are here too. It's a friendly crowd, so welcome to all of you. Okay, from there, let's go. Okay, so I want to start by talking about the ugly word we have up here, Chinaman, and its historical significance. So in the 19th century, the period I'm going to mostly be talking about, Americans used this term liberally. They used it in newspapers, they used it in court cases, they used it in government documents, in everyday speech, right? And they used it to define or to identify an identity, a racial group that they believed to be innately different. And it's interesting that even Chinese people at the time when speaking English also identified. They called themselves Chinamen, right? So Chinamen denoted a sort of certainly racial difference and to some degree racial inferiority, but it wasn't at the time sort of an aggressive racial slur. And so in my sources, Chinaman, but also the longer phrase here, Doe Chinaman, or sometimes John Chinaman, is ubiquitous. It's just across 19th century records. And I think that the word, although it is ugly to us now, gives us a sense of how the Chinese were viewed by the US government and by white Americans at the time. So in 1852, California census counted about 2,500 Chinese in San Francisco. And of those 2,500 Chinese, they only noted about 24 of them by name. All the rest were simply just Chinamen. And you can see here, I hope you can see, in Tuolumne County, the first line just says John Chinaman, and it says profession, Chinaman. Place of birth, sorry, not China, China. Place of birth, China, last residence, China, right? So this is the concept. And then everyone after that is not even John Chinaman, just China. So you get a sense of this sort of, the Chinamen are being anonymized here, right? They're becoming interchangeable. They're becoming inscrutable, just in the way that they're being written about in this, in a sense. For me, one of the most powerful visual examples of this sort of forcible, aggressive way that Chinese were anonymized is this image. It was titled at the time, 2,700 Boy Babies of San Francisco Chinatown in 1889. I found this image in the Bancroft Library, so Berkeley. It's in the scrapbook of a man named Jesse Brown Cook. When he was putting these scrapbooks together, he put together more than 50 scrapbooks, many of which still survive. He was a retired police officer. He had risen all the way to the rank of the chief of police in San Francisco. But earlier, more around this time period, in the late 19th century, he was the head of the Chinatown squad in San Francisco. There was a specially designated squad of police for Chinatown. A few years earlier, in 1882, the United States declared the Chinese were undesirable race, and they barred most immigrants from China from entering the United States. And then in subsequent decades, the federal government passed a series of Chinese exclusion laws and that pledged to keep the Chinese out, although often failed. But I think that this is the story we often tell, right, of border control when we're talking about Chinese. But border control only addressed part of the problem in the minds of people that saw these people as a racial threat, right? Because what about the Chinese that were already in the country? What about these infants and their parents and the wider Chinese diaspora in the American West? So while many white Westerners declared that the Chinese must go and fought for exclusion, I think men like the policeman Cook were more concerned about the Chinese population already living in the United States. So sociologists have a couple of ways that they understand how they measure segregation. One of the ways they do it is through something called the dissimilarity index. What this is they take census records, right? So we saw a page of a census record. The page of census records is about like a block, because the census taker would just kind of go door to door and write down people, right? So it gives you a page, is like, you can picture like a city block. And then they look at, if each page is about a city block, they look at how integrated or segregated those pages are in comparison to each other. And the way they do this is they say, okay, if it's a perfectly integrated city, then nobody would need to move within this city. No one would have to switch pages. No one would have to move down the block to become integrated. And that would be a dissimilarity index of 0. In a perfectly segregated city, everyone would have to move. 100% of people would have to shift to be able to break this down, and that would be a dissimilarity index of 1. So an index score of 0.6 means 60% of people have to move in order to integrate the city. That is considered a highly segregated location, 0.6 or 60%. In Sacramento in 1880, the dissimilarity index was 0.78. So 78% of Sacramento folks would have to move in order to integrate the Chinese community, right? That's how segregated they are. To compare that, in San Francisco, it would have been 87%. 87% of people would have to move. These numbers are quite high, even if we're looking at urban segregation of black people in a slightly later period, in the midst of Jim Crow. These are really, really high segregation levels. Okay, so what caused such segregation? Lots of things. So one of the clearest examples of how the state achieved segregation is through Chinese removal laws, or what we might call racial zoning laws. The California Constitution of 1879 affirmed that this was possible, that you could remove the Chinese from your town. So the Constitution said, the legislature shall designate all necessary power to the incorporated cities and towns of the state for the removal of Chinese without the limits of such cities and towns, or for their location within prescribed portions of those limits. So in other words, the Constitution gives the towns the ability to move the Chinese out of town or put them in a designated part. The moment this was written, before it was written, it was already unconstitutional. Right? The 14th Amendment says that all people should be equally protected under the law, and this was unconstitutional. Despite that fact, a few cities tried it. One example is Sacramento, where they proposed a bill. The Board of Trustees did it, and they considered it in January of 1886. And it proposed an ordinance that said it was a duty of each and every Chinese within the limits of the city of Sacramento to remove outside the limits of the city of Sacramento on or before March 1st, 1886. So it gave a deadline. However, this stayed as just a bill, because once the Board of Trustees handed it to the city attorney said, no. This is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. We're going to get sued immediately And so it never passed in Sacramento. Another set of laws also created segregation, and these are Chinese land laws or alien land laws. So if they couldn't zone for particular places, racial groups, perhaps they could just prohibit property ownership entirely. Many states tried this using alien land laws. Alien land laws actually date back all the way to the colonial period, but the West Coast sort of reinvented this as a form of racial control. They didn't used to have racial meaning when they were used in the colonial period. So an example here is the Oregon Constitution, which bars Chinese from owning property. I don't have it written down. Okay, Montana, also barring mining property. Washington Territory, which targets not the Chinese by name, but again, those incapable of becoming citizens, which is code language for Asians. Idaho, directly barring Chinese or Mongolians from owning real property. And then finally, California, quite late actually, it started in 1913, and more concerned about Japanese at this point, are aliens ineligible to citizenship. So that is all Asian people who own property. Many of these laws you can see are about mining and they're about land, but they bleed into real estate. In addition to these legal ways that Chinese were segregated, there are also the extra legal ways. Most apparently forms of violence. And this is the subject of my first book. It's my first book in which I look at expulsions of Chinese in 1885 and 1886. More than 165 communities tried to drive out their Chinese neighbors. And one of the things I point out in my first book is that although this is extra legal, this is outside of the law, a lot of the people that we associate with law were involved, right? Sometimes the mayor, sometimes the sheriff, the chief of the fire department, like people that represent law are often involved in these sorts of expulsions. Local examples include San Jose. This is an image of the burning of San Jose's Market Street Chinatown in 1887. After this burning, the Chinese were not allowed to rebuild. Instead, they were designated a special new area that they could build. Right? So it was an effective way through urban planning after the fire to move them outside the city center. For those coming from Truckee, I thought I'd put Truckee up here. So the burning, the original Chinatown in Truckee burned repeatedly. When it burned in 1878, the Tahoe Business Association purchased land farther outside of town, across the river from Charles Crocker, and then you can see in the deed, they marked it out for Chinatown. So it's a combination of fire, it's unclear if that was arson, fire, and then like urban planning, pressuring the Chinese to move out of town. In addition to violence, there's also this other legal tool for segregation that might be familiar to some of you because there's been recent legislation around it here in California. They're called racial restrictive covenants. It is the way that people started writing into their deeds or into their leases racial language. So just a few years ago, California just passed a law saying we need to try to strip these out of the deeds because actually they're still in a lot of people's deeds, this racial language. No one has ever taken it out. The earliest known racial restrictive covenant comes from Ventura County, which it was in 1886, where an individual sold two properties next to each other, but under the, in the deed they wrote in and said that no Chinese person, no Chinaman may ever live or lease on these properties. And then when a Chinese person did lease on these properties, they tried to drive them out and the Chinese sued. And won, in fact, against this racial deed. But unfortunately, that's one of those wins that didn't stick. Because as you may know, racial restrictive covenants became very popular as a way to sort of through private discrimination to create segregation. And so eventually it sort of traveled out and began to affect Black people in the South and the North as well. A couple decades after, it started here in California, targeting Chinese. Much like racial zoning laws that also started here in California regulating the Chinese, and then in that case, like 30 years later, traveled out and started real attempts at racial zoning against Black people as well. The other thing I wanted to highlight is just real estate practices. We know that realtors also have a large role in who can live in particular places. The researchers in Stanford sent out a survey to real estate boards in 1924 asking about segregation. This is one of those sources that's amazing. You're like, I would like this survey too. But they just sent out a survey and said, okay, who are you segregating? You know, like check the box, tell us. Chinese, Japanese, Negroes, or Mexicans. And then how are you segregating them? And they just set this across more than 40 cities. Sacramento did not write back, so I can't say Sacramento. But I picked Yolo County, so for the Davis folks, to see. We can see in Yolo County, it says there's fairly well-defined section for Chinese and Negroes, and that it's mostly they're segregated through custom, right? Of the 46 California realtor boards that returned this survey, 30 of them reported specific restrictions on Chinese residency, mostly through these subtle things: custom, real estate practice, and special understandings. Also, there's these laws that are just regulating nuisance and sanitation, or disease, or quarantine. These general outcast laws. So these images are from San Francisco, where fears of bubonic plague in 1903 led to the destruction of hundreds of homes in San Francisco. And so I found these images in the notebook of a health inspector. Right? So they're just tearing down buildings within Chinatown. Often I'm asked about other Asian groups, right? And one of the reasons that I speak mostly about the Chinese is that they're the first Asian group to come in large numbers to California, to the whole West Coast. And Japanese start to come in larger numbers in the 1890s, but they don't actually, they surpass the Chinese, I think, in 1910. There's more Japanese than Chinese. So it depends when we're talking. We talk early on that essentially the Chinese are often grouped just within the Chinese quarters. And in agricultural or small towns, this could sometimes be just like lodging houses together, or Chinese camps in the mining regions. But in the later period, into the 20th century, I think increasingly these groups are together, right? So you'll see Chinese and Japanese, and then sometimes, they're in small numbers, African Americans, Mexican Americans all grouped together. And I'll point out, since we're sitting in this beautiful old theater, which I don't know the history of this theater, but you can see segregation in other spaces as well, right? So schools and in theaters. And so in my book, for example, I talk about the segregation of theaters in places like Reno, Nevada, and Seattle, and in California, in the Bay Area, where there are theaters that would segregate Asian Orientals alongside African Americans, often in the balcony. And so you see another space in which these groups of people of color are being grouped together. So for the archives for these, basically I walk into an archive, the Center for Sacramento History, and just ask, what do you have on the Chinese? And interestingly, that produces a lot. It's partially because, if you don't know, you haven't spent lots of time in archives, archivists are absolute experts in their local space. They know more than I could ever know coming outside what they have. And so that's how I walk into an archive. I always say, like, what do you have? What should I know? What should I look at that I don't know? In many of the sort of small county archives, like Contra Costa County or Tuolumne County, often I also literally ask, do you have a Chinese box? And that's because, or Nevada County is another example, because A lot of the local volunteer-led archives are mostly frequented by genealogists, and so things are organized by names, but Chinese names are so challenging or they're nameless. And for that reason, often these local archives will actually literally have a Chinese box where they just put everything else they don't know how to catalog into a box, which is way for me. And so when I look at legal records, I look for simply Chinese names. And I started out just looking at every single legal record that had a Chinese name on it until I saw so many I was dizzy, right? And partially it's because you do this learning process. You start out trying to read everything, and then you sort of slowly figure out patterns or things that you're more interested in. And over time, one of the things that I realized is that I was interested in particular, the ways in which Chinese were contesting these racial laws. Because Chinese end up in court for lots of other reasons, right? They're like petty crimes and things like that. So then I started going into these archives and looking for these moments when a Chinese person sued the tax collector, for example. Like they did in Placer County, or trying to think of another quick example, or I looked a lot at death inquests actually, in part because there were so many laws around Chinese testifying in court. Chinese weren't allowed to testify against white people for quite some time, but in death inquests they actually were allowed to testify to their experience. So I looked at a lot of those. I guess one of the things I want you to feel is both the presence, when you do see it, of the long Chinese American history that has been here in California, but also to notice the absence when you don't see it because it is strange, and it is related to this history.
What's your name? I'm giving it to you. Okay. So, I think you have writer's cramp. I can still write my name. It's good. Yeah. Same. I know some Lou's. Oh yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah, my dad hears your bio. My dad hears it. Okay. Thank you for coming and congratulations and.
I've traveled to so many different county archives in California, and I never know what to expect. So when I went to the Center for Sacramento History, it was such a pleasure that they have so much material, so well preserved. And I worked with Kim Hayden, who just knows that archive inside and out and helped me find some amazing things, including an amazing collection of Chinese mug books from the 19th century in the center. And this image that I used as the cover of my book is one of those mugshots. I was just always struck by this image of a man named Chui who was arrested for stealing a box of cigars, allegedly, and then imprisoned for 2 years for this. And there's something about his look, the look in his eyes. I knew immediately that I wanted him to be staring down, not just me, but everyone else.